weren't the Founding Fathers themselves Christians who intended to form a Christian nation?
No. So there
You
were...
just shot an arrow at all my elementary school education right there.
And half of our audience just tuned
right.
out.
Right, I know.
No, this is important. This is why we want this Dr. Frazer.
Yeah, when
on.
I speak at places, I wear a plastic suit.
Good.
So
It's probably good news.
Should start wearing a bulletproof vest now.
rotten fruit doesn't stick. No, there were, I want to be clear, there were Christians among the founders, okay? There were Christians among the founders, but those who were most influential on the founding, those who were most influential on the founding documents, wrote the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and those who were entrusted to put the system into place, like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, what I call the key founders in my book were not Christians. And I believe that both the left and the right are wrong on this issue. The right is wrong, they weren't Christians. The left is wrong, they weren't deists either, or rank secularists. They were religious men, they just weren't Christian. And I take my evidence from what they said in private. My assumption is that people are more, especially politicians, and they were politicians, especially politicians, and just about anybody is more honest in what they say in private that they don't think anyone else will see than things that are in public. And a number of the letters and so forth that I read from these founders in my research, they would tell the recipient, after you read this, burn it. Or Thomas Jefferson once went to the widow of one of his friends who had died to get back his letters.
Wow. Interesting.
And so in looking at their diaries, their correspondence, what they said in private with others and so forth, I concluded that the 8 key founders, as I call them, were not Christians. They were, and I invented the term theistic rationalists. So theistic rationalism is, they were raised in Christendom, as it was known. They were raised under a general sort of atmosphere of the Bible and whatnot. And then they were educated in Enlightenment thought. And these 8 guys didn't fully buy into either of those camps. And so rather what they did was they took what they thought was rational from Christianity and took what they thought was rational from Enlightenment thought and rejected the rest and had sort of their own belief system. Jefferson even said at one point, as far as he knows, he's a denomination of one. But in reality, he and John Adams were like this on it, and so on.
The Jefferson Bible proves that, how he cut out everything that's
cut out everything supernatural and spirit. He famously said that Jesus never claimed to be God, but that's easy for him to do once he cut out all the verses in which Jesus claimed to be God.
How convenient, yeah.
So they were influenced by both Christianity and Enlightenment thought, but rejected the things that they thought were irrational, not reasonable, and sort of constructed their own belief system. Or as I put it at the end of my book, they created God in their own image. They sort of returned the favor.
Isn't that interesting? I'm thinking back on my education. So in elementary school, I was brought up in whatever our history classes were, how that subject gets taught, that this is a Christian nation. Yeah. The founding fathers were all Christian. Then I get into high school, and it was they were all deists. Just God's up there in the clouds doing something, letting us do what we want to do down here. And then we have now since used the term a few times in our podcast, this theistic rationalist, coming from Gregg's book and his research, that you coined this phrase, which is why we wanted you on this particular episode of Pastor Scholar, because that does find this unique, not middle ground, but they really were, as you said, a subset. They're influenced by the Bible, influenced by Enlightenment thought, and somehow welded these things together in a unique experiment type
Yeah,
thing.
and this gets back to what we were talking about before about Christian, that word, that term. And what I did was, and I didn't want to use, I wanted to use what was viewed as Christianity by the churches then.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at the creeds and confessions and statements of the 18th century churches in America and outlined 10 fundamental beliefs that they all ascribed to. 10 things that they all ascribe to. This is what it means to be a Christian. And then compared that with the beliefs of the founders. And the founders basically agreed with one of them, and that one makes them not deists. That is, that God is active in the world, that he's present and active in the world. But on the other 9, most of them they did not. A couple of them believed in miracles because they thought it was not irrational that a God who created things would want to be still involved in it and could violate his own laws to do that. Most of them didn't believe in miracles because it was irrational for them that a God would create laws and then break them.
But rationalism, man's reason, is still the benchmark for these
rationalism is the benchmark. It's also the benchmark for them of what counts as revelation. They believed in revelation also, which also makes them not deists. They believed in some revelation, but they determined what counts as revelation based on whether they thought it was rational or not, which explains why Jefferson cut out the supernatural from the Bible and then accepted what he called the moral teachings of Jesus, because to him that was actual revelation. And so that's the basis on which they decided that Jefferson had no room for the Apostle Paul. He said, actually, Jefferson called the New Testament, other than the Gospels, a dunghill. That was one of his famous or favorite terms for it. And he called the Apostle Paul, he said nasty things about the Apostle Paul, and that people were dupes who followed him.
This is the problem with man's reason being the authority over everything. I mean, Thomas Jefferson can call the Bible or the New Testament, or specifically the Pauline corpus, a dunghill. So he has to rescue the Bible from itself and create his own copy and paste. What is a rational, acceptable type of Bible. This really shows the danger of man's reason being the authority usurping everything else, when it should be man's reason submitting to Scripture.
Well, here's the way I talk about it. That they believed that one could reason their way to God. And here's what I tell my students. There were 3 people in the history of the world that had unfallen reason, and 2 of them reasoned their way away from God.
That's right, Adam and Eve. Yep.
They were in the garden with him
right.
and reasoned their way away from
That's a
him, and
great
the other
point.
one was Jesus, who
That's
was
right.
God. So all the mere humans...
The fall that we're in, we can trace it to reason, to rationality, right?
So, of the requirements you gave for who, the 9 of the 10 that you came up with, who among the founders were actual Christians in your view?
So Roger Sherman, and I would say Roger Sherman, John Jay, and John Witherspoon. There are others that people make a case for that I haven't studied, and so I don't want to say. But there are, I think probably there are several others as well.
Because the majority of them denied even the Trinity, right? Because it's not rational.
Yeah,
And you have, that bars you from being a Christian right there.
one of the guys that is generally accepted by most as a Christian was John Adams, and that's the problem. The problem with this is most people, when they look at it, they go by denominational affiliation. So this guy went to a Congregationalist church, therefore he was a Christian. And then sometimes they do nice public pronouncements, which, by the way, aren't written by them; they're written by aides. But anyway, they do nice public pronouncements. Well, they know what the people want to hear. It's just like politicians today. That's why you have to get at what they said privately. But John Adams, yes, he went to a Congregationalist church. People can't see my air quotes, but or maybe they can't.
They can.
Yeah, I guess so. He went to a Congregationalist church, but by the time he was of college age, that church had become Unitarian.
Yeah.
It still had a Congregationalist name and association, but it was Unitarian. It didn't even believe in the God of the
Which is
Bible
heretical.
anymore.
Yeah.
And the most outrageous quote that I found in 30 years of studying this, 30 years, was John Adams, who wrote to Jefferson and said concerning the Trinity, he said, if you and I had been on Mount Sinai with Moses, and there we beheld the Shekinah glory, in other words, God is speaking to them, and there we were told that that 1 is 3 and 3 is 1, we wouldn't have believed it. We might not have said anything, but we wouldn't have believed it.
Even if they're on the mountain with God.
And
in front of them.
God himself tells them the
Shows
Trinity
them.
is true, he wouldn't believe it.